The moment I realized my own family had already decided I didn't belong anymore, I was sitting at the same kitchen table where I used to draw birthday cards as a kid. Daniel Reed stared at his untouched coffee as the morning sunlight cut across the Reed family kitchen in a quiet suburban home outside Chicago, Illinois, where everything looked normal on the surface but felt completely different underneath. The house was worth nearly $1.2 million, yet in that moment it felt colder than any place Daniel had ever been. Megan Reed, his sister-in-law, stood near the counter scrolling through her phone without looking at him, while Chloe Reed, his younger sister, was organizing papers on the table with an unusual sense of urgency that Daniel couldn't ignore. Robert Reed, his father, sat at the head of the table like he always did, but his silence felt heavier than his words ever had. No one asked Daniel how his night had been. No one acknowledged his presence the way they used to, and that absence of basic connection was starting to feel intentional. Daniel had noticed small changes over the past few months, like conversations stopping when he entered a room or decisions being made without him being informed, but he kept telling himself it was stress, timing, or just life moving fast. That morning, however, felt different. There were printed documents neatly stacked beside Chloe, all aligned too perfectly to be casual, and every time Daniel tried to catch someone's eye, they shifted away just a little too quickly. Megan finally spoke without looking up, saying they needed to clarify a few things about the household structure, a phrase that sounded rehearsed rather than natural, and Robert simply nodded without adding context. Daniel asked what she meant, but instead of an answer, Chloe slid a sheet of paper across the table toward him, stopping just short of his hands. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't warm either, and the distance between him and that paper felt like a statement in itself. The document outlined responsibilities, roles, and financial contributions within the Reed household, but Daniel's name appeared in a section labeled non-essential. Support, a classification that made no sense to him. He looked up expecting someone to laugh or explain it away, but no one did. Instead, Robert finally broke the silence by saying they were restructuring things for clarity and efficiency, as if Daniel was part of a business system rather than a son who had grown up in that house. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not from anger, but from the slow realization that this conversation had been planned without him. Megan added calmly that everyone had agreed this was the best direction moving forward, and Chloe avoided his gaze entirely, focusing instead on aligning the edges of the papers as if perfection in presentation could soften the impact of the words. Daniel asked when exactly everyone had agreed, and the answer came in silence, a silence that told him he was not included in that version of everyone. The room that once held family dinners, laughter, and holidays now felt like a negotiation table where the outcome had already been decided before he walked in. Daniel leaned back slightly, scanning each face, trying to find even a trace of hesitation or guilt, but all he found was certainty. In that moment, something inside him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing in a house he didn't realize he had already been pushed out of. Daniel Reed did not move for a few seconds after the papers were placed in front of him, not because he did not understand them, but because understanding them meant accepting something he was not ready to accept. The kitchen of the Reed family home in suburban Chicago, Illinois, still felt the same in shape and structure, but every detail now felt slightly off, like a familiar place viewed through glass that had just been cracked. Megan Reed finally sat down across from him, placing her phone face down on the table for the first time that morning, as if she had decided this conversation required her full attention. Chloe Reed continued adjusting the documents with careful precision, aligning corners that were already perfectly straight, a nervous habit that now felt more like avoidance than organization. Robert Reed remained at the head of the table, hands folded, posture steady, his expression calm in a way that did not match the weight of what was being discussed. Daniel asked again, slowly, what exactly this restructuring meant, and Megan answered this time with a practiced tone, explaining that the household needed clearer financial boundaries, clearer responsibilities, and a more efficient way of managing shared expenses. She said the word shared as if it had always been in question, as if Daniel's place in the household had been something temporary that now required formal definition. Daniel looked down at the document again, noticing how his name appeared less like a person and more like a category: placed under a section that suggested limited decision-making influence and reduced financial involvement. He asked when this had been decided, and Megan responded that it had been discussed over the past several weeks during family conversations he was not present for, as if absence was a normal condition for exclusion. Daniel turned his attention to Robert, hoping for some correction, some acknowledgement that this was not how things were supposed to be, but Robert only nodded slightly and said that these changes were meant to avoid confusion in the future. The word confusion felt strange to Daniel because nothing about this situation was confusing in structure, only in intent. Chloe finally spoke, her voice quieter than the others, saying she thought this would make things easier for everyone, but she did not look at him while saying it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, placing his hands near the edge of the table, asking directly if there was something he had done to cause this shift, and for a moment, no one answered. The silence that followed did not feel like uncertainty, it felt like restraint, as if the answer existed but had been collectively agreed not to say out loud. Megan eventually replied that it was not about something he had done, but rather about aligning expectations moving forward, a phrase that sounded rehearsed again, like it had been repeated before this moment. Daniel noticed how smoothly they spoke, how none of them interrupted each other, how every response seemed prearranged to avoid emotional friction. He looked around the table and realized this was no longer a conversation but a presentation, and he was the only one who had not seen the slides beforehand. Outside the kitchen window, morning traffic moved along the street as usual, neighbors going to work, children heading to school, life continuing in a way that felt completely disconnected from the stillness inside the house. Daniel asked one more question, softer this time, asking if anyone had considered how this would make him feel, and again the answer came without words. Robert shifted slightly in his chair and said they were focused on what was practical, not emotional reactions, as if emotion had become irrelevant in the structure they were building. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that morning, because it confirmed what Daniel had been trying not to believe, that his presence was no longer part of the equation. Only the logistics of his absence were. Megan gently slid a pen toward him, suggesting he review and acknowledge the document so they could all move forward, and Chloe finally looked up for a brief moment before looking away again. Daniel stared at the pen without touching it, feeling the full weight of a decision he had not been included in but was now expected to accept. In that quiet kitchen, surrounded by people who shared his last name, Daniel Reed understood that nothing in the room was going to change for him, only around him. The silence in the Reed family kitchen outside Chicago, Illinois, stretched long enough that Daniel Reed could hear the faint sound of the refrigerator humming behind him, a sound that suddenly felt louder than any of the voices in the room. Megan Reed was still holding the pen in front of him, not forcing it into his hand, but leaving it there in a way that made refusal feel like the only action left. Chloe Reed had returned to adjusting the papers, but her movements were slower now, as if even she was beginning to feel the weight of what was happening. Robert Reed finally shifted in his chair again, clearing his throat softly before speaking in a calm, controlled tone, saying that no one was trying to remove Daniel from the family, only to redefine expectations so there would be no misunderstandings in the future. The phrase, "no misunderstandings," felt strange to Daniel, because the only thing clear in that moment was that he had not been part of any decision being presented to him. Daniel looked down at the document once more, scanning the sections again, noticing how carefully the language had been constructed to sound neutral while producing a very specific outcome. He pointed at one line and asked if this meant his financial input into the household would now be considered optional rather than shared, and Megan immediately responded that it was more about clarity than limitation. She said clarity again, as if repeating the word could make the situation sound reasonable. Daniel then asked who exactly had been involved in creating this document, and for the first time, Megan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying it had been discussed between her, Chloe, and Robert over several weeks. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, processing that sentence, realizing that multiple conversations had taken place inside this house without him ever being included, while he continued living in it as if nothing had changed. Chloe finally spoke again, her voice careful and soft, saying she thought this would help reduce tension in the household, but she still avoided looking directly at Daniel. He asked her what tension she was referring to, because from his perspective, nothing had been said openly until this morning. That question made the room fall into another pause, not as heavy as before, but more uncomfortable, like something fragile had been exposed. Robert answered this time, saying that over time there had been concerns about dependency and balance, and that restructuring roles was a responsible step for everyone involved. Daniel repeated the word dependency quietly, as if trying to understand how it applied to him in a home where he had grown up and contributed for years. Megan gently pushed the pen a little closer again and suggested they could finalize acknowledgement so everyone could move forward with clarity, and Daniel noticed how often moving forward was being used, as if the past no longer required discussion. He asked if there was any version of this situation where his opinion would have changed the outcome, and no one answered immediately. The lack of response told him more than any explanation could. Outside the kitchen window, a delivery truck passed by slowly, and Daniel briefly thought about how ordinary the world outside remained while everything inside this room had quietly shifted into something unrecognizable. Chloe finally looked up at him, just for a moment, and said she was sorry if this felt sudden, but the decision had not been sudden to them. That sentence landed differently than everything before it, because it confirmed time had already passed without him being aware of it in the way he now understood. Daniel looked at each of them again, not with anger, but with a growing sense of distance, as if the room had expanded and he was no longer standing in the center of it. Megan exhaled softly and said they were trying to do what was best for the household structure, and Robert nodded once in agreement, reinforcing that statement without adding anything new. Daniel slowly pushed the pen back across the table, not dramatically, but with enough intention that it came to rest near Megan instead. He said he needed a moment to think, and for the first time that morning, no one tried to stop him or persuade him further. In that quiet exchange, Daniel Reed began to understand that what had been presented to him was not a conversation waiting for his input, but a conclusion already written before he ever sat down. Daniel Reed left the kitchen table without signing anything, not with anger or confrontation, but with a quiet step that felt heavier than anything he had said that morning. The hallway of the Reed family home outside Chicago, Illinois, suddenly felt longer than usual as he walked away from the kitchen where Megan Reed, Chloe Reed, and Robert Reed remained seated in silence. No one called his name immediately, and that absence of reaction felt more final than any argument could have been. Daniel stopped briefly near the living room doorway, looking at the familiar space, where family gatherings, holidays, and ordinary evenings had once taken place, and for the first time, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Behind him, he could hear the faint movement of papers being gathered, the soft shuffle of a pen being placed down, and the subtle sound of Megan speaking in a lower tone, likely continuing the conversation he was no longer part of. He did not turn back. Instead, he walked toward his room, the same room he had used since he was younger, now feeling like a temporary space rather than a permanent part of his life. As he closed the door behind him, Daniel stood still for a moment, not sitting down, not moving, just processing the fact that nothing in that kitchen had been spontaneous. Every sentence had been prepared, every response measured, every silence coordinated. It was not confusion he felt anymore, but recognition. He opened a drawer and looked at the few personal items he kept there, noticing how little of his life actually remained tied to this house in a physical sense. A few documents, a set of keys, and an old notebook were all that remained. Yet even those now felt disconnected from the place they were stored in. Outside his room, the house continued to function normally, footsteps moving occasionally, doors opening and closing softly, voices shifting between rooms as if the morning conversation had been absorbed into routine rather than disruption. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed but did not lean back. He replayed the conversation again in his mind, focusing not on the words themselves, but on the structure behind them, the timing, the agreement he was never included in. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the decision had not been made in the kitchen that morning, but long before he ever entered it. In another part of the house, Megan Reed was likely organizing the documents again. Chloe Reed was probably returning to her usual tasks, and Robert Reed would have already resumed his quiet routine as if nothing irreversible had just occurred. That realization created a strange sense of distance in Daniel. Not emotional chaos, but clarity forming slowly, and uncomfortably. He stood up again and walked to the small window in his room, looking out at the neighborhood where everything appeared unchanged. Cars parked neatly, lawns maintained, life continuing without interruption. It struck him how easily the outside world ignored internal decisions made inside closed doors. Daniel checked his phone, noticing a few missed notifications unrelated to anything that had happened that morning, reminders of normal life that now felt slightly out of place. He placed the phone back down and exhaled slowly, realizing that staying in this house without addressing what had just happened would only extend a situation that had already been decided without him. Downstairs, the sound of a cabinet closing echoed faintly, followed by Megan speaking again, her voice steady and practical, likely returning to planning or organizing as if the conversation had reached its conclusion. Daniel understood that from their perspective, it had. He was no longer part of the ongoing discussion, only part of its outcome. He sat back down on the bed again, this time more slowly, and looked at the closed door of his room, realizing that the space between him and the rest of the house now felt like a boundary that no one had officially drawn, but everyone already respected. In that quiet separation, Daniel Reed began to understand that what had been presented as restructuring was not about adjustment, but about replacement, and he was already standing on the outside of what used to be called family. It was late afternoon in the Reed family home outside Chicago, Illinois, when Daniel Reed finally realized that the silence after the morning conversation was not temporary, but intentional. The house no longer felt like a place waiting for resolution, but a place continuing its routines without him being part of them. Downstairs, he could hear faint activity, drawers opening and closing, the soft rhythm of footsteps moving between rooms, and occasional voices that no longer paused when he entered their space. Daniel remained in his room for hours, not because he was avoiding confrontation, but because he was observing something he had never noticed before: how easily life continued without his participation once he was no longer included in decisions that mattered. Around mid-afternoon, he heard Megan Reed speaking on the phone in the hallway, her tone calm and organized, discussing schedules and arrangements in a way that suggested forward planning had already resumed. Chloe Reed passed his door once without stopping, carrying a folder that looked similar to the documents from the morning, and she did not knock or acknowledge him. Robert Reed remained mostly unseen, but his presence was confirmed through subtle sounds of movement in the house, as if he was maintaining distance without needing to announce it. Daniel stood up and opened his door slightly, looking into the hallway where nothing seemed different on the surface, yet everything felt structurally changed. He walked downstairs slowly, not expecting to be included, but needing to confirm what he already suspected. In the kitchen, Megan was reviewing printed pages again, now placed in a new stack labeled with handwritten notes. Chloe sat at the table, typing on a laptop, while Robert stood near the counter looking out the window. When Daniel entered, the room acknowledged his presence only briefly, with Megan glancing up for a second before returning to her documents. Daniel asked what was happening now that the morning discussion had ended, and Megan responded without hesitation that they were finalizing the implementation of the household adjustments discussed earlier. The phrase sounded final, not exploratory, and it confirmed that the decision was no longer theoretical. Daniel asked if any part of that implementation required his input, and Megan replied that at this stage, most details had already been agreed upon collectively. The word collectively once again excluded him without needing to say it directly. Chloe looked up briefly and said they were trying to minimize disruption for everyone involved, but her tone carried less certainty than before, as if she was repeating something she had already accepted rather than actively supporting it. Daniel turned to Robert, asking directly if this was truly how things were going to continue, and Robert answered with a calm statement that sometimes families need structure adjustments to maintain long-term stability. That sentence confirmed to Daniel that the situation was not being reconsidered at any level he had access to. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, noticing how naturally the others continued their tasks while speaking about his exclusion as if it were a neutral administrative change. Megan mentioned that financial responsibilities would be updated in the coming days, and Chloe added that communication moving forward would be more streamlined to avoid unnecessary confusion. Daniel listened carefully, realizing that every explanation was designed to sound reasonable while reinforcing separation. He asked one final question, asking when exactly he stopped being part of the decisions affecting his own place in the house, and the answer was not spoken immediately. Instead, Megan paused for a moment before saying that no one was trying to remove him, only redefine roles based on current needs. That answer did not address the question, but it revealed something more important. Removal did not need to be acknowledged in order to occur. Daniel looked around the kitchen again, this time not searching for explanation, but for confirmation of reality, and what he saw was a household already functioning as if his presence was optional. He stepped back slowly, realizing that the conversation from that morning was not the beginning of change, but the moment he was finally informed of a change that had already taken place without him. That night, the Reed family home outside Chicago, Illinois felt quieter than it had ever felt before, not because there was no movement, but because every sound now seemed carefully contained within separate spaces. Daniel Reed remained in his room for most of the evening, sitting near the edge of his bed without turning on the main light, watching the faint glow from the street outside filter through the blinds. He had not spoken much since returning from the kitchen earlier, and no one had come to check on him in a way that suggested concern rather than formality. Downstairs, the household continued its normal rhythm, but it was a different kind of normal, one where paths no longer crossed unintentionally. Megan Reed moved through the house with focused efficiency, occasionally speaking in short calls that sounded like coordination rather than conversation. Chloe Reed stayed mostly in the dining area with her laptop, working through documents that now carried clearer structure and updated labels that Daniel had not been part of defining. Robert Reed remained in and out of sight, present but not engaged in any visible attempt to reconnect the morning discussion into something more personal. Daniel eventually stood and walked slowly down the hallway again, not because he expected anything new, but because staying isolated in his room felt like accepting a version of reality he had not chosen. As he reached the stairs, he paused briefly, listening to the house. There were no raised voices, no tension in the traditional sense, only a calm continuation of decisions already made. In the kitchen, Megan looked up as he entered but did not interrupt her task. Chloe shifted her attention for a moment, then returned to typing, and Robert gave a brief glance before looking away again. Daniel asked if there was anything left unresolved from earlier discussions, and Megan responded that most items had already been clarified and that remaining adjustments would be implemented over the next several days. The word clarified again carried the same weight it had earlier, something that sounded neutral but functioned as final. Daniel asked what exactly would change in practical terms, and Megan explained that financial responsibilities, shared access, and household roles would be gradually adjusted to reflect the new structure they had agreed upon. Daniel noticed that every explanation used language that implied agreement, even though he had never provided it. He asked directly whether his absence from those decisions mattered at all, and for a brief moment, no one responded. Chloe finally said quietly that they were trying to avoid unnecessary conflict and make the transition smoother for everyone, but her voice carried less confidence than before, as if repetition had replaced certainty. Robert added that families sometimes need to evolve their structure to maintain stability over time, and Daniel realized that this explanation was no longer meant to be questioned, only accepted. Megan continued reviewing a checklist on her screen, occasionally marking items as completed, and Daniel could see that what had once been conversations was now turning into a system. He asked if there was any point where his perspective would still be considered in future decisions, and Megan replied that communication would remain open, but structural decisions would continue to follow the agreed framework. The answer sounded polite, but it confirmed separation more clearly than rejection ever could. Daniel stood still in the kitchen, noticing how naturally everyone continued their tasks while describing a version of his life that no longer required his participation. He thought back to earlier that day, realizing that what had felt like a sudden shift was actually the moment he became aware of a process that had already been in motion for a long time. The realization did not come with anger, but with a quiet understanding that staying would not restore his place, only extend his awareness of its absence. For the first time that night, Daniel did not ask another question. He simply looked at each of them, not searching for explanation, but confirming what he already knew. In that still kitchen, surrounded by people who shared his last name, but no longer shared his decisions, Daniel Reed understood that the structure of his family had already changed, and his role within it had already been written without him. By the third day after the morning meeting, the Reed family home outside Chicago, Illinois no longer felt like a place in transition, but like a place that had already settled into a new operating system. Daniel Reed moved through the house with less hesitation, not because anything had improved, but because repetition had replaced uncertainty. He no longer waited for inclusion in conversations. He simply observed them from a distance when they happened near him. Megan Reed continued managing documents and calls with the same structured focus, often speaking in terms of updates and implementation rather than discussion. Chloe Reed spent more time at the dining table with her laptop open, occasionally referencing schedules and lists that Daniel was no longer asked to review. Robert Reed maintained a steady presence that never interfered and never intervened, as if his role had shifted from participant to observer. Daniel noticed that everyday interactions now carried a consistent pattern. Information was shared only after it had already been finalized. That pattern became clearer when Megan mentioned a new set of financial adjustments over breakfast, explaining them as part of the ongoing restructuring. Daniel asked when those adjustments had been discussed, and the answer, as before, pointed to conversations he had not been part of. Instead of reacting immediately, Daniel simply listened this time, noting how easily decisions continued to move forward without requiring his acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, he walked into the kitchen and found Chloe reviewing printed schedules that included updated household roles, with sections highlighted in different colors to indicate responsibilities. Daniel stood near the doorway for a moment before asking if there was any expectation for him to review those changes. Chloe hesitated briefly before saying that most of the structure was already in place, but feedback could still be submitted if necessary. The word "submitted" stood out to Daniel because it implied a system he was now external to rather than part of. Megan entered shortly after, carrying a folder, and confirmed that the current phase of adjustment was focused on stabilization rather than negotiation. Daniel asked what stabilization meant in practical terms, and Megan explained that it meant reducing overlap, clarifying independence, and ensuring each member of the household had clearly defined boundaries. Robert, standing near the counter, added calmly that clarity often required emotional distance at first before long-term balance could be achieved. Daniel processed those words without interrupting, realizing that what they described as balance felt increasingly like separation. That evening, he noticed that conversations in the house were no longer spontaneous. They appeared scheduled, with topics aligned to tasks rather than shared moments. Even meals felt more structured, with fewer pauses and less informal exchange. Daniel began spending more time outside, walking short distances around the neighborhood to avoid staying inside a space where he was no longer part of its decision-making rhythm. When he returned later that night, he found a new set of documents on the kitchen table, this time already labeled with implementation dates and responsibilities assigned to each member of the household. His name appeared only in reference to informational acknowledgement rather than participation. He did not ask why this time. Instead, he read silently and placed the papers back where he found them. Megan noticed him standing there and asked if everything was clear, and Daniel responded that clarity was not the issue anymore. That statement caused a brief pause in the room, not because it was confrontational, but because it reflected understanding rather than confusion. Chloe looked up briefly, then returned to her screen without comment. Robert remained quiet, observing the interaction without adding interpretation. Daniel walked out of the kitchen shortly after, not because he was avoiding the situation, but because he had already recognized its direction. Upstairs in his room, he sat down and realized that nothing in the house was being done against him directly anymore. Instead, everything was being done around him, with increasing precision and decreasing necessity for his involvement. In that realization, Daniel Reed understood that the process was no longer about explanation or agreement, but about completion, and he was no longer positioned inside the structure that was being completed. 1 week after the morning meeting, the Reed family home outside Chicago, Illinois had fully transitioned into a structured routine that no longer required Daniel Reed's participation to function. The household no longer felt like it was adjusting. It felt like it had already adjusted and simply continued forward without pause. Daniel moved through the house with quiet awareness, noticing that his presence no longer changed the flow of conversations or decisions. Megan Reed managed daily operations with a level of organization that now extended into every shared space, often referencing schedules that Daniel was no longer included in when they were first created. Chloe Reed worked consistently from the dining area, updating digital files and printed summaries that reflected a system Daniel only saw after it had already been finalized. Robert Reed remained consistent in his distance, present in physical space but absent from any direct engagement that might alter the established structure. Daniel began his morning sitting alone in the kitchen before anyone else arrived, observing how the house functioned before communication began. When Megan entered, she briefly acknowledged him before reviewing a set of updates related to financial allocations and household responsibilities. Daniel asked if there had been any new decisions overnight, and Megan confirmed that most changes were refinements rather than new directions. The language of refinement had become common, replacing any sense of open discussion. Chloe later joined the kitchen and mentioned that communication channels were being streamlined further to reduce overlapping information, explaining it as a way to maintain efficiency. Daniel asked what that meant for his role in ongoing conversations, and Chloe paused before saying that most operational decisions were now handled within predefined responsibilities. That phrase again reinforced what Daniel had already begun to understand, that his input was no longer part of the process, only something that could be reviewed after completion. Robert spoke briefly later in the day, stating that stability in a household often required clear separation of responsibilities to avoid long-term friction, and Daniel listened without responding, recognizing that the explanation had become standardized rather than situational. Over the following days, Daniel noticed that references to him in household discussions became increasingly indirect. Instead of being addressed as a participant, he was referenced in terms of acknowledgement, confirmation, or notification. Even small decisions, such as scheduling maintenance or planning meals, followed the same pattern of being decided before reaching him. One evening, Daniel found a new printed summary on the kitchen counter detailing finalized structures for the coming month. His name appeared in only one section, indicating informational awareness rather than involvement. Megan entered shortly after and asked if he had reviewed the document, and Daniel replied that he had. She asked if anything required clarification, and Daniel said that clarification was no longer necessary because the structure itself had already been defined. That response caused a brief pause in the room, not from disagreement, but from recognition that further explanation was unnecessary. Chloe continued typing without looking up, and Robert remained near the window, observing quietly without comment. Daniel realized that the household was no longer in transition. It had reached a stable configuration that no longer depended on negotiation or adjustment. Later that night, Daniel walked through the house and noticed how each space now reflected consistency rather than change. Conversations were shorter, movements more predictable, and interactions more procedural than personal. When he returned to his room, he sat down and considered how naturally everything had progressed without resistance. There was no moment of final declaration, no single event marking exclusion, only a gradual alignment of systems that no longer required his participation to function. For the first time, Daniel understood that what had been unfolding was not a series of decisions against him, but a structural shift that had already completed itself in stages he was never part of. In that realization, he recognized that the household he once considered his family home had become an independent system operating on its own terms, and his role within it had quietly ceased to exist without interruption or conflict. 2 weeks after the morning in the kitchen, Daniel Reed stood outside the Reed family home in suburban Chicago, Illinois, holding a small bag with only the belongings that still felt personally connected to him. The house behind him looked unchanged from the outside, the same structure, the same windows, the same quiet neighborhood atmosphere, but for Daniel it no longer represented anything he was part of. He had not been asked to leave in a dramatic moment, and there had been no confrontation that marked an ending. Instead, his departure had formed itself slowly through a series of quiet adjustments that no longer required his presence to function. Inside the house, Megan Reed continued managing schedules and financial coordination with consistent precision, as if the system they had built remained unchanged regardless of who occupied it. Chloe Reed remained focused on maintaining updated documentation and communication flow, often working in the dining area, where structured organization had replaced informal family conversation. Robert Reed continued his presence within the home without altering its direction, observing rather than participating in decisions that had already stabilized over time. Daniel took a final look at the house before turning away, not expecting anyone to stop him, and no one did. There was no final discussion, no last request, and no attempt to reinterpret the structure that had already been established. As he walked down the driveway, he noticed how normal the street looked, with neighbors going about their routines, cars passing occasionally, and the world continuing in a way that did not reflect the internal shift that had taken place inside the Reed household. Daniel reached the sidewalk and paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that nothing was pulling him back. The absence of resistance confirmed what he had already understood in the days leading up to this moment. The household had already completed its transition without needing closure. He began walking slowly down the street, carrying only what remained of his personal identity outside of that structure. There was no anger in his thoughts, only clarity forming through repetition of everything he had observed. Each conversation, each adjustment, each absence of inclusion had led here without interruption. Behind him, the house remained active, but no longer connected to his decisions or participation. Daniel continued walking until the distance between him and the home became significant enough that he no longer felt its influence in his immediate awareness. He stopped near a corner and looked back one last time, seeing the roofline partially obscured by trees, unchanged and indifferent to his departure. In that moment, he understood that leaving had not been an event, but a confirmation of something already completed long before he physically stepped away. The realization did not bring shock or conflict, only final understanding that belonging is not defined by presence alone, but by participation in decisions that shape direction. Without that participation, presence becomes observation, and observation eventually becomes separation. Daniel turned forward again and continued walking, not toward a specific destination, but away from a structure that no longer included him in any form of ongoing definition. The Reed family home remained behind him, functioning exactly as it had in the days prior, but no longer connected to the life he was now stepping into. In that quiet separation, Daniel Reed understood that the moment he was removed from the decisions that shaped his own life was also the moment he had already begun to leave, and what followed was only the physical completion of a change that had already fully taken place. In these emotional family stories, a quiet household transformation unfolds where the son begins to notice he is being gradually excluded from decisions that shape his own life. As tensions rise between the son and the sister-in-law, subtle conversations and unseen agreements begin redefining their roles within the home, a pattern often found in family stories that explore trust and betrayal. The father maintains a calm distance while the sister observes in silence, reinforcing a system that feels increasingly irreversible, which is a recurring theme in family stories centered on emotional detachment. What begins as informal discussions evolves into structured household restructuring, where communication is replaced by implementation and clarity replaces connection, reflecting the tone of many modern family stories where emotional bonds shift into procedural boundaries. Within these family stories, change often happens quietly rather than dramatically. In the end, the son steps away from the only home he has known, not through conflict but through realization, understanding that belonging is defined not by presence, but by participation in the decisions that shape a life. And what remains is a silent separation that marks the final turning point of everything he once believed to be permanent. Character 1. An adult white male in his mid-30s wearing a simple casual button-up shirt and dark jeans, standing in a neutral indoor setting, front-facing portrait, realistic photography style, soft natural lighting, calm serious expression, shallow depth of field, cinematic detail, minimal background distraction. Character 2. An adult white female in her mid-30s wearing a neat professional blouse and tailored skirt, standing in a neutral indoor environment, front-facing portrait. Realistic photography style, soft, even lighting, composed expression, cinematic depth, clean minimal background, high detail focus. Scene 1. In a dimly lit modern kitchen inside a suburban American home, Character 1 and Character 2 stand across a large dining table covered with scattered documents, printed financial statements, and highlighted restructuring papers. Their expressions tense and emotionally charged, both locked in a silent but intense confrontation that feels like a breaking point in a long-hidden conflict. The atmosphere heavy with unresolved betrayal and shifting family power dynamics. Natural light from a nearby window casting sharp contrasts across their faces. Scene 2. Character 1 in his daily life. Walking alone through a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago, wearing casual clothes, holding a coffee cup, his expression thoughtful and withdrawn, passing identical houses and trimmed lawns, showing a sense of isolation and internal reflection as he processes emotional distance from his family. Scene 3. Character 2 in a calm but controlled home environment, sitting at a clean, organized desk inside the same house, working on documents and digital schedules, wearing a professional blouse, focused and composed, surrounded by neatly arranged files and a laptop, representing structure, control, and emotional restraint. Scene 4. In the same kitchen environment, but later in time, Character 1 and Character 2 appear alongside the father figure in a tense three-person interaction, documents and financial plans visible on the table. The father standing slightly apart, observing silently, while the two main characters engage in a controlled but emotionally charged exchange that suggests final decisions being enforced rather than discussed. Scene 5. Character 1 alone inside his bedroom at night, sitting on the edge of the bed with minimal lighting, a small packed bag beside him, looking at the closed door in silence, symbolizing internal realization and emotional withdrawal, while faint household activity is visible outside the room, indicating life continuing without him. Scene 6. Final scene outside the suburban house during late afternoon. Character 1 walking away down the driveway carrying only a small bag, not looking back, while Character 2 is visible inside through a window continuing structured work at a table, the house remaining active but emotionally distant, capturing the final separation and irreversible shift in family structure. Character 1 and Character 2 facing each other in a modern kitchen with scattered documents on a table. Tense atmosphere, serious expressions, soft daylight, realistic cinematic style. Character 1 walking alone in a quiet suburban street holding coffee, reflective mood, simple casual clothing, natural daylight, realistic cinematic style. Character 2 working at a clean desk inside a modern home, organizing documents and laptop, calm focused expression, minimal background, realistic cinematic style. Character 1 and Character 2 in the kitchen with a father figure present. Documents on table, serious discussion atmosphere, controlled tension, realistic cinematic style. Character 1 sitting alone in a dim bedroom with a small bag beside him, quiet reflective mood, low warm lighting, realistic cinematic style. Character 1 walking away from a suburban house, while Character 2 remains inside working at a desk, emotional separation implied, late afternoon light, realistic cinematic style.